Good day to you all, wherever you are in the world, particularly to our guest tonight, who has joined us from the USA. Welcome to the British Interplanetary Society's fourth live-streamed Q&A session. I'm pleased to say everything worked well last time, except for my camera, which had a problem with the color balance. I hope I've sorted it out this time. If any of you don't know me, then my name is Alistair Scott. I'm a past president of the British Interplanetary Society and now help run the events of the society. In lockdown, this can be a rather interesting exercise. Now, if any time the link that we've got at the moment falls out, I'm reliably informed by people who know about these things that you should just click on the same URL or link and rejoin the session at more or less the same point. Now, on to tonight's program. I hope you've all had the chance to watch Chris Carberry's excellent talk on alcohol in space. Though I had heard some of the stories before, I learned a lot. We already have a number of questions, but if you have any more, please email them to me as soon as possible on streaming@bis-space.com. I'm pleased to say we have Chris with us tonight to answer your questions. Chris is the co-founder and CEO of Explore Mars and was an executive director of the Mars Society. So I'm going to hand over to him now and ask him to tell you how he actually got into this job of writing a book about alcohol in space. I'm sure it's fascinating. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Cheers. At any rate, it was an interesting story. Within the space community, we often talk about whether you can actually create alcohol in space. Over years after conferences, we'd often go to bars, pubs, and eventually start talking about whether you can make beer in space or what Martian wine would taste like. Would it taste like the soil? Would it taste rusty? And for years, I was mulling over a paper on this topic, somewhat lighthearted paper talking about the prospects of alcohol in space or what Martian beer would taste like. But the more and more I thought about it and researched, I realized there were real companies working on this, and there was a fascinating history on it. So I kept looking and found dozens of organizations and companies that are actively pursuing prospect of manufacturing or consuming alcohol in space. Plus, there's an interesting backstory of people drinking in space, far more than you would imagine. And then when you team that with the history of science fiction depictions of it, putting that backdrop of alcohol, how it's impacted civilization throughout history, and how it's not likely to stop once we go into space, I realized there was more than enough for a book, and I might as well be the first one to write it.
Okay, I'm sorry for the break there. We had a little bit of a technical problem. I'm hoping that we can now get on with the questions and that Chris is ready to answer them. And the first one is from Mike Lawford in Harpenden. And he starts by saying, I've just watched Chris's talk, which is a great example of an area of research that first appears to be frivolous, but actually produces solutions that have so many more mainstream practical uses. Is there an official explanation backing up the formal prohibition of drinking alcohol in space? And has this ever been reviewed? I can see that on the first solo flights, no one wants to be sitting drinking on their own, but as missions have become longer and longer and the size of crews expanded, I'm sure that psychologists would have been keen on the type of alcohol-supported social gatherings that Chris said occur on the ISS to help astronauts' mental well-being and keeping their spirits up. Over to you, Chris.
Yes, that was a nice long question.
It was.
I think the core part of the question was, what was the rationale behind the prohibition in space, and has it ever been reviewed? And there have been actually many reasons I've heard for the prohibition. There's a current one I always hear with the current space agency, at least NASA. It's that the gases coming from the alcohol can actually damage the filtration system. Whether that is actually the case, I don't know, but that's one of the official reasons I give. But early on in the space program, when they were doing, as I mentioned in my talk, I believe, when they were originally making the menus for the Skylab, they were originally going to send wine up. And that fell apart largely because of public perception. I think that's largely what drives it. They don't want the public to feel that, well, the astronauts, cosmonauts, everybody else are drinking up in space. And particularly here in the United States, where we're particularly schizophrenic on the topic of alcohol, I think it was just they were afraid of the public relations problems. And I think it has been reviewed a bit on and off, but NASA particularly doesn't like to touch the topic. And so, well, I believe that they accept that goes on. I don't think they're particularly anxious to actually officially allow it. Now, once commercial astronauts, private astronauts go up, if there are space hotels, if we really have true private individuals going into space, that's going to go away. People will bring alcohol, and that'll be more formal. But whether space agencies officially accept it anytime in the near future, I doubt it. But as for the question of going to Mars on long voyages, once again, you might have a situation similar to now where it's officially prohibited, but it's kind of with a wink, wink. And because like when I interviewed, for instance, John Grunsfeld, 5-time shuttle astronaut, and he's also been repaired the Hubble Space Telescope 3 times. And I didn't expect John to talk about this at all, but he was pretty honest that he figured if you're going for basically 2.5 to 3 years on to Mars in transit on the surface and back, it's probably a good thing to bring a little bit of alcohol to help calm your nerves after a long, stressful day. It's just part of that. It's part of your psychology as a crew. So I think eventually it'll become more and more common, but I think that'll wait from the official side until we're actually going to Mars. But I think it'll just be shorter term when we actually have private astronauts going into space more frequently.
Great, thank you. I hope that's answered his question. Now, my second question then is from Les Shoulder. He's in East London on the Essex borders. And he asks, one of the biggest new markets for drinks lately has been the development of 0 and low degree beers, lagers and wines. Many of the largest brewers, distillers and wineries are involved in promoting some of their most famous brands. How soon do you think it will be before commercial pressure on state and private sector actors in the space industry leads to an official endorsement of the first product that can be advertised as the drink of astronauts, cosmonauts, and the official drink of the International Space Station?
I don't think with the current rules that's going to happen. I think there are ways around that, though. For instance, the goal of the International Space Station is to make it at least partially privately run by the end of this decade. So as long as it's being, and I'm going to take when I'm answering questions, it's going to be largely from a NASA perspective. But I don't see NASA, and it's really against the rules. They're not supposed to endorse specific products anyway, and that's regardless of alcohol or not. But if ISS can truly go private, they can find a mechanism to make that actually viable from a financing and technical perspective, then you're going to see more of these opportunities. Or, for instance, there is actually interest from NASA. They mentioned that they would approve this if a viable plan came about to make a movie in space with Tom Cruise. Now, when you're doing something like that, if there is a private entity up there actually producing a movie or doing something else, you do have opportunities for advertising that way. I just don't see any time in the future an official space agency saying, that, for instance, Budweiser sent up, the American beer manufacturer sent up barley experiments to ISS. They sent up 4 of them. I held up 3 fingers and said 4 of them. I don't expect NASA to suddenly announce that Budweiser is the official beer of ISS. I don't think the international partners would want to agree with that either. But I do see as it becomes more privatized, you might have opportunities like that.
Well, thank you. I think that's answered that one. We're looking forward to the private. I expect Elon Musk would have a few things to say about this question. So we'll wait and see.
Oh, I'm sure he will. And, you know, it's interesting. And this is why I think it's actually people are getting more and more interested in this now. It's really this whole concept of alcohol in space. It's really bloomed over the last 5 or 6 years, actually really starting in 2011 when Ardbeg sent their aging experiment up to ISS. Now that was a really quickly developed experiment. They had almost no time to develop it, got sent up, and then spent more time there than it was supposed to, wasn't handled very well on the way back. So it influenced taste, but I think it inspired a lot of people to really think about, well, what could we do? And if we have space tourism, and right now it's looking more and more realistic. Even a few years ago, it still looked ways off, but now I think we really look well positioned to have, you know, that age of space tourism that we've been hearing about for decades. So I think that's generally motivated people. And so it'll be interesting how this happens. And this is where, and this is also one of those little loopholes in the prohibition of alcohol in space. There is official alcohol in space. It's just the consumption that is prohibited. There are experiments going on, as I mentioned. Either there are experiments related to alcohol, and kind of going back to your first question, where those experiments that actually have other benefits, going back to that Budweiser experiment, or even many years earlier when Sapporo sent up a barley experiment as well. These companies are investing in agriculture, vital capabilities, vital technology if you want sustainable human presence in space. And so many of these projects have other purposes as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this develops. And as more and more private entities send people into space, how much that accelerates the whole concept of alcohol in space. Because I think because there's a section in the book regarding, you know, why. And a big part of it is, I think there's some real passion there, but I also think alcohol companies want to associate themselves with space exploration. It is a big, sexy topic. The entrepreneurs doing space tourism and launches like Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, and many others, they're just elevated with this, you know, with the millennial generation. And so I think alcohol producers, particularly beer manufacturers, are trying to link themselves to that space sexiness.
Right. Well, the next question actually, to some extent, goes back in time, because he says, and it's Les Shoulder again, he says, do you think the ban on alcohol in space was originally put in place out of a real fear of a potential drunken outburst? Or could it be that the known large cost of transporting each kilo of supplies to orbit might be seen by the taxpayers as a luxury too far?
I don't think it was either. I think there's always the fear of somebody getting inebriated in space and in basically creating a disaster. And, you know, if there's something goes wrong, the astronauts get drunk and there's a disaster, that would probably mean the end of the whole program. So that was a real fear. But I think more than the reality of it, I don't think most of the mission planners and the managers really thought that was a major problem. I think the real issue was perception. I think perception is often what drives funding for program, public perception. If there's a hint that there might be, these heroes, particularly in the early part of the space program here in the United States, where the astronauts were put up on a pedestal, they're, kind of positioned as they were as military heroes, and, thought of them, drinking in space, that they believe NASA thought might tarnish that image and could impact the overall funding moving forward. And then that all makes sense even now. Whereas the space program, where it seems to be moving forward again, it's still a very small number of people in space and who have ever been in space. And so I think when you have a space program, and I suppose that's the key, you need to get beyond a space program, you need actual sizable numbers of normal individuals in space. So once you have a large number of non-astronauts in space, that's when it's going to become more acceptable, because you can't expect everybody else to not drink. I understand right now they're going under the same assumption like with airline pilots. You don't want your airline pilot drinking while they're flying. I believe there's a rule like 8 hours, can't drink within 8 hours, some countries more. But I don't know what it is in the UK. But with astronauts, it's a little long. It's not that much longer, though. But you understand that. If they're responsible for driving the ship, for flying the airplane, you don't want them drinking at the same time. But when you have a large number of people who have no responsibility for making sure your spaceship doesn't crash, then they have that freedom. And this also goes to what it is for real space settlement, sustainability. It's not realistic like it is now, in the future, for everybody to be on duty 24 hours a day. Right now, even though they have off time, they get to sleep, they're officially on duty 24 hours a day. So that's not a sustainable model if you want actual space settlement, space tourism. People need to be able to relax and say, well, I'm taking a day off, truly taking a day off.
Yep, we'll look forward to that in the future. Most of us are on 24/7 at the moment. Yeah. It's called lockdown. Right. Well, I'd have another question, which is almost a follow-on from the one before, and it's from Junior Miranda, and it's from Homon de Espacho in Brazil, I think. And the question is it true that there were flights inside the Mir or Salyut space stations were fights inside the Mir or... I misread that. Were fights
they
inside...
fly. There's microgravity, so they get to fly around.
Yeah, no, there were fights inside the Mir or Salyut space stations due to the use of alcohol by the crews. Is that true?
If it is, I didn't hear anything about it. I found no evidence of people getting inebriated in space. Most of the evidence, I've heard, some stories, I've heard of arguments and people getting angry in space, but it's unclear whether that had anything to do with alcohol. It's a stressful environment, like particularly on the Mir space station, particularly when the shuttle Mir program started. And of course, they had a collision, they had a fire. There was good reason for the astronauts and cosmonauts to get angry with each other, get upset, get emotionally charged. But actually, for instance, after the fire on Mir, one of the solutions that Russian mission control sent up to them is to take a little bit of the medicine, which was, not so subtle code for Cognac. By the way, I forgot to mention, which I do mention in the video, Cognac is the drink of choice in space, not vodka, not beer, not gin, or rum.
Right. Well, we'll have to stick to beer then. Right. I've got question 5 here, and it's again from Les Shoulder, and he asks: are there any dark corners in the space station where an enterprising crew member could keep his homebrew kit bubbling away nicely in its redundant plastic dustbin?
Well, there are a lot of little corners. There are a lot of places on ISS. I don't think right now that would pose some problems, because it would also probably be sensed. The sensors might pick it up, because of course when you're fermenting, you're going to create CO2. And so it'd be interesting to see how much that would affect the systems, as you're probably pumping CO2 into your environment. So I don't know, at least in the very confined space of ISS, how well that would work. I mean, there have been fermenting experiments in space on a very, very small scale. And there are ways to offset that, you know, to collect the CO2. So I think, you know, if you did that, you would need to find it, particularly if you're doing it on a scale that was actually worthwhile doing to drink. So you weren't just drinking, you know, beer the size of a thimble, you know. You need to find a way to counteract that, collect the CO2. I don't believe anybody's doing it now, at least informally, but there have been fermenting experiments up in space. I know even as early as 1992, there was a fermenting experiment that was run by a graduate student in the United States in Colorado, and she partnered with Coors and an aerospace company who's Bioserve. And they sent up, I believe, 2 experiments, yeast experiments, and experimenting with fermentation back in 1992.
Yeah, well, it's going to happen. I shall stick to the beer then. Thank you. I've got mine with this special mug. I've got to thank Richard for this jug here, this glass. I think he found it for me. Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not using a glass with any labels on it, but I'm not drinking beer either. So.
Right. Well, mine's flat British beer. No CO2.
Which is a good segue because flat British beer is probably the ideal beer for space. As I mentioned in the talk, one of the biggest challenges with beer, particularly, you know, with the high carbonation types of beer, is, well, carbonation is not, it doesn't work well in space because, as we all know, in 1G, the gas flows up, disperses in the atmosphere, but in space it doesn't. It goes to the center, starts expanding, and does that in your stomach. So it's not very pleasant. You know, the astronauts who've consumed carbonated beverages have reported stomach cramps and wet burps, and it's basically not a very pleasant experience. So it's not the way any beverage manufacturer is going to want to have their the experience they want to actually have for their product. So this is an area which, once again, I talk about in the video. There are actually several companies looking at this, and, you know, can you find the right balance for a beer so it still tastes like beer? There's some carbonation, but it's not completely flat. And one company in particular down in Australia, which was a collaboration between an aerospace company, Sabre Astronautics, and Four Pines Brewery, created Bostock beer. And the whole point of that was to find the beer that could be consumed in microgravity. And they eventually picked a stout, for 2 reasons: because the level of carbonation was appropriate, but also because the other issue in space with food is that most astronauts report that they have diminished capacity of taste. Their taste buds are affected. It feels like you have a head cold. So astronauts generally like bringing hot sauce up to space. Apparently, there are a lot of stories of them anxious at the new supply ship, you know, with the hot sauce, because all the food tends to taste a little bland. And I think that's probably an inherent problem anyway, because of the type of food they send up. But I think the hot sauce is also important because we already have this diminished sense of taste. But going back to the carbonation, and there are other companies looking at this as well. In France, champagne producer Maison Mumm is also looking at this. They created a special bottle for dispersing the right version of their champagne for consuming in microgravity, and a glass, because they stated their goal is they wanted to create the proper conviviality for drinking their product, their bubbly, in microgravity for future space tourists. So it's interesting, the variety of groups, companies, big companies and small companies that are doing this. I mean, some of the big companies include, like, as I mentioned, Maison Mumm, but Budweiser, United States, Suntory, the Japanese whiskey maker has an experiment, a whiskey aging experiment up there right now. One of their experiments already came back, but they've been very silent about the results. But there's still one up on ISS, as I mentioned, Ardbeg, and there are others as well. It's actually interesting to see how many of these larger alcohol companies are entering into this market.
Right. Well, I've got a question that's actually not so much on the commercialization of it, but Chris, no, it's Steve Salmon is asking the question from London, and he says, have there been any regular foodstuffs sent into space for the consumption of astronaut crews, which in microgravity conditions inadvertently fermented to produce an alcohol effect?
I have not heard anything like that. And one of the issues why I think it's probably unlikely is the way the food is stored. You know, they store it in such a way that's going to prevent fermentation. It's going to prevent, air getting in. So unless they actually have the food sitting out in oxygen for long periods of time, which would not be the case, they're very strict on how they manage their waste. I think it would be very difficult for that to happen just because of how they store the food and how they get rid of their food. They dispose of their waste after they consume their food. So that I don't see happening, at least in the current environment. But it would be interesting. This certainly will happen sometime in the future. And, eventually, people will start doing like the previous question of, is there a dark space or a hidden space on ISS? That will, if it hasn't happened already, it eventually will, because particularly when we're away from Earth for a long time, because it's just the nature of humans, as they're far away from Earth, they're getting bored also. And the current crisis around the world has also taught the whole world about how to deal with isolation. And I think the level of alcohol being consumed has increased worldwide as well. But one other example I cited in the book, during the original Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona, they did. Eventually, after a while, they did try to manufacture, and they succeeded in manufacturing alcohol. They eventually succeeded with a banana wine. Apparently, it didn't taste very good, but it didn't matter. They needed a drink. And so, but that was after a couple. And in that environment, if you actually have an environment where there's actually food out there growing in the open, and there are experiments on ISS, agriculture experiments, mostly with lettuce and other things like that, but not exactly your ideal crops for fermentation, although you can ferment it, but it's not going to just suddenly ferment if you leave it alone for a while. I think eventually that will happen, but it's not, long-winded answer for a simple question. But yeah. I think right now, the way we handle the food on ISS is not likely.
Well, he goes on to actually ask the question, I wonder if the first alcohol truly made on the moon will earn the name of moonshine.
It would be, that it should. And frankly, moonshine basically would be probably a pretty good first one anyway. Fairly distillation, as long as you can manage the whole flame issue, fire in space tends to freak people out if you have a high oxygen atmosphere. But we've looked at some of the alcohols which would be easier to make. Beer is one of them, because that's fairly straightforward, to create as long as you have the raw ingredients and the yeast. But if you have the alcohol, if you distill it if you distill it, there's no reason why you couldn't make moonshine. And if you made it on the moon, and it'll be interesting. And this is another interesting area which I found fascinating with the book. What would be, first off, what's going to turn into the ideal fuel stock for alcohol when you're on the moon or Mars? Will we use the same sort of fermentable crops that we do on Earth, or maybe not, because those might not be as practical. yeah, we use a very small number of potential fermenting crops here on Earth. We know which ones work the best. We know we like the taste. We know which ones you can utilize the sugar. And so it's really a small number of crops that we use, whether it be, barley or other grains, corn, potatoes, etc., or sugar cane. But in space, we might end up using things like algae. We might use, I have a whole section in the book of, unusual crops that could be used to ferment alcohol that have been used here on Earth that aren't popular. We don't use often, but people have tried it, like using beets or using, lettuce or other unusual crops. And as we start building up a population on the moon or Mars or elsewhere, it'll be interesting to see which crops they pick, how they actually ferment in that space, how they age. And so we might have a whole new categories of alcohol based on the environment and the crops that we're using on the moon or Mars. So it could be very interesting to see just the future of, what new alcoholic varieties there will be based on the entirely different environments that we've never been able to test in before. So that should be fun. And think how much those first products will be able to be sold for here on Earth.
Fascinating. Will we be around to actually see it happen? Good question. Right, I've got another question. Sorry, yes, I'm rattling on. We've got another 6 or 7 questions just arrived in, so I better move on. I've got a question here actually from Ange. He's a member of the BIS and is also in London. He thanks you very much for an interesting and fun presentation. And he then asks, could you tell us more about that spinning satellite which is up there? Who launched it? When did they launch it? Who controls it? And from where? And most importantly, how do they control what can only appear to be a limited amount of experiments which are placed on board pre-launch? And finally, when all the experiments are, and what will happen to it?
I'll be able to answer a good portion of these. Probably some of these answers I'm not quite sure of. But the spinning one, I'm assuming you're talking about the Eucropis satellite that DLR, the German Space Agency, sent up last year, I believe. Yes, I'm trying to remember which year we're in right now. It's all times seeming to run together now. So I don't know if it's 2020 or 2025 at the moment, but seems like forever I've been sitting at home. But yeah, the Eucropis experiment, which is really exciting. That's one of my favorite ones going on right now because it's actually testing something that we've been hoping to experiment or test for years. It's, as mentioned in your question, it's a spinning satellite that has tomato seeds in it for, with a greenhouse with tomato seeds. I think some other things. It also has some synthetic biology experiments on it as well. But the really exciting thing about this project is that it's doing 3 experiments, basically 3 gravities. The microgravity that we already have experience in without any spin. Then they spin it up to 1/6 gravity, simulating the gravity on the moon and see how the growth happens there. And then they spin it up to 1/3 gravity to simulate the Martian gravity. And, to this point, we have no real data sets for growing crops in 1/3 gravity or 1/6 gravity. There have probably been, I think there have been some in spinning here on Earth in that sort of experiment. But I think this is probably the truest one we have had. So it'll be interesting to see the results. I admit I have not heard if there are any results yet. I did email the head of the DLR the other day, asking her to provide a speaker for one of my webinars. But I was going to, at that point, I was going to ask for an update. So I wish that webinar had happened first. But I think this will be an interesting one to see, because that'll tell us a lot about the viability of growing crops in all these environments. Because right now, while we have had simulated Moon and Mars agriculture experiments, none of them have been, of course, obviously have been in lunar or Martian gravity. The closest we've done are experiments using simulated lunar or simulated Mars regolith and seeing how various crops grow. And these have some benefits, but they're not exact, of course. Like the lunar stuff, they find the right one that has similar mineral content and is extremely sharp, because in the lunar environment, there's no corrosion, of course, because there's no wind, no water, flowing water. Not that there's flowing water on Mars now, but there's plenty of erosion on Mars and Earth. But so on the moon, it's very sharp. And so, people have always been interested if that impacts agriculture. But on Mars, even though we even know more about the soil, and we have some good simulants, it's still not perfect. And we, of course, there haven't been too many experiments, if you include one of the toxins on Mars that we know are there now, perchlorates. And so, will the plants grow? Will they absorb the toxins? But with all of that, we haven't, one of those core questions that DLR is exploring now is, will they grow? How will they grow in 1/3 and 1/6 gravity? We probably, since things will grow in microgravity, we assume that they'll grow in 1/6 and 1/3 gravity, but we don't know that for a fact. But as for the other questions, I don't know the answer to all the other questions on how they are, how they're reporting back. And I haven't heard any of the updates lately on that.
I'm sure there'll be a big write-up fairly soon, but in the image of the satellite that you use, you show a green emission from behind it. Is that just Hollywood or a real death threat?
Hold on. I think it's just Hollywood, but now I have to look it up. If you haven't seen the book, buy it on Amazon.
We'll buy it. Yeah.
1 second. Now I'm intrigued. Sorry. Oh, yeah. So there is. I'm assuming that's some sort of propulsion in the back. I don't know if it really looks like that or not, but I suspect that's mostly for show. But the satellite will need to control itself with propulsion to make sure it maintains an orbit. It'll need to spin itself up as well. So I assume that is simulating some sort of propulsion for the satellite.
Right. Well, we're on to the next question here. I'm just getting it up on the screen. And it's from Alex Wood. And he asks, you mentioned that Ardbeg whiskey wasn't handled well in space. What happened?
Now, this isn't exactly, I can't tell you this definitively, but from what I've heard, even from the people at Ardbeg, so they basically had to put this experiment together in essentially 2 weeks, not exactly a long period of time to put together a solid space experiment. They put it together in partnerships with NanoRacks, company in the United States that sends up payloads to ISS. And they've done a lot of these experiments. They even sent up 12 bottles of Bordeaux just a few months ago to ISS. But this was a really quick progress. So they got it up there. It went, it was sitting up there for, forgot how many years. Let's see, went up in 2011, came back in 2015. So 4 years. It was only supposed to be up there for 2 years. And the core, this experiment, of course, they can't send barrels into space. They're thinking about some better simulation for barrels, but essentially they just put little wood chips, basically chips from barrels, into the mix sticks. But this was all rushed, and coming back, apparently there wasn't any safeguards for all the shaking and all, because it's a harsh environment. When you're going up, it shakes a lot. Coming down, it shakes a lot. You're not going to be able to prevent some level of shaking. It's a fairly violent environment when you're launching and coming back. But they are thinking of ways of counteracting that, insulating them from this, from the elements that these the experiments were exposed to. Because apparently when it came back, and of course they were ground samples, control samples that were in Houston at the time, and it was dramatically different. And according to David Blackmore, brand ambassador here in the United States for Ardbeg, it was dramatically different and not for the better. You know, had kind of a fishy smell to it, which is not, it's not really a quality you want in your whiskey. So well, did I answer the question? I can't remember the question now.
That was the question. What happened to it?
Okay, great.
You've answered that one. Now, Alex has got a second question here. Why did Greg Olsen's Rootstocks die on the way down from the ISS?
Once again, this is only speculation. This is speculation from Greg. You know, I don't think he knows exactly why. They survived up there. When he was up there, there's a picture of him spinning a little tube in space with one of the rootstocks, and they were alive at the time. But the time they got back, you know, it's still kind of fragile. So it could very well, and maybe the temperature wasn't appropriate. Maybe the temperature went below the bounds or above the limits to what the rootstocks could endure. Maybe they got shaken too much. Maybe they were just, maybe they weren't retrieved quickly enough. But that's, you know, he doesn't know the answer to why they died. He just knew that they died between when he had them on ISS and when they came back to him on Earth. They had died in that time period. So he assumed it was the handling. That doesn't necessarily mean handling by humans, by the people on the ground. It could have been as it was on entry, descent, and landing, as it's landing, or as it's being transported, you know, so not necessarily anybody's specific fault, but just the whole traumatic experience these rootstocks are going through to get back from space and into the hands of Greg Olsen.
Yeah, well, that's the sad thing about returning, but we're going to find out what happens when we get out of lockdown. I think we're like re-entering the world. So we'll see. Right, we've got another question here. It's actually from Russ Palmer, who operates from, he's in Essex in the UK. And he says, "Hi, Chris, enjoyed your talk, very enlightening. I'm very curious to know, where do you get those microgravity glasses?"
Oh, you mean, wait, hold on a second. 1 second, I'm going to step out of my screen for 1 second. All right.
Yeah,
so I'm assuming you're talking about, this is one of them. This is a cocktail glass for microgravity.
Right.
And so these are not readily available right now. This one, which is made by a company called Cosmic Lifestyles Corp. Created actually several years ago, tried to create this whole business, did a Kickstarter campaign, and didn't make that much money. They got a lot of press, but didn't get a lot of money. Kind of shut down for a while, but they've been building up more momentum lately. Actually, they partially because of the book, they tell me, because it's building up interest. So this one, I only have this because one of the partners on that was commercial astronaut Richard Garriott. And Richard and I did a talk at the Explorers Club in New York back in December. And so Richard, a couple of weeks before the talk, had the company 3D print me one of these. So he brought one for himself and I had one. So they kind of smelled like, had a synthetic smell, smelled like wet paint. So we didn't drink out of them, but we put our glasses in them and drank like this all night. So you can't get these right now, but hopefully if the company actually is successful in rejuvenating their product, maybe we'll be able to buy them. Frankly, maybe they should. They might be able to sell a lot of them and help finance the company by selling them. This one is actually not a functioning one, because a functioning one would have a hole here. Because they can't pour it in the top in microgravity, it's just not going to go anywhere except all over the place. They fill it in from the bottom, and then the beverage flows up through these grooves. And they did a lot of fluid dynamic experiments. They know that fluids will adhere to a surface even in microgravity. And if they could find a way of directing it, so this is what they came up with, filling it from the bottom, and it comes up the grooves so that you can actually sip it like you would a normal cocktail glass. But there are other companies like another group called the Open Space Agency. It also did a Scotch glass. I mentioned earlier that Maison and Mumm did a champagne glass. And also, actually, Vostok, that other beer, space beer, also had a dispenser, and we're practicing, I believe, with glasses as well. But none of these, unfortunately, are available to the public as far as I know. But as I said, it's not a bad idea to use that as a fundraising device, because not many people currently have microgravity cocktail glasses or Scotch glasses.
Well,
my Scotch glass here would not work in microgravity very well. So.
No, well, actually, I've got an email here from Jill Norman, who is our executive secretary of the BIS. And she just says, has Chris seen the Ballantine space glass that a company called Open Space Agency developed to drink whiskey in space? They actually are friends of the BIS, and they operate from our own building. So we know them rather well, and I'm sure they learned some of their ideas from some of our members.
Yeah, and there's a section in the book about them.
Yeah, well, we'll have to get the book and read up about it. It's a clever device. They've brought it down to us so that we can test it, but we've never had the whiskey.
See if they would have sent me one of their whiskey glasses, I could have held that up. But yeah, this is the only one I have, thanks to Richard Garriott and the other group.
I'll speak to James Parr and see what he's got for us. Right.
I did have a nice conversation with James Parr for the book. So.
Oh, good. So you've met him then. Good. Right. Well, I've got a question from Alan Marlowe himself, who's working with us tonight, and he's in Milton Keynes. And he says, were NASA officially or even unofficially aware that Buzz Aldrin took wine to the moon to take communion?
They were both. It was mostly unofficially aware. And this was actually, Buzz actually wanted to do this publicly. He talked to Clayton about it. See, Buzz had arranged this in advance with the Webster Presbyterian Church in Texas, his church. And he wanted to do something special. He talked to the minister there, and they thought that a communion prayer, with wine in a goblet, would be an appropriate way to honor, the first people being on the surface of the moon. And so he had, so he brought a small amount of communion wine, this little goblet, and some prayers as well. And he had originally wanted to do this during his open mic portion of his statement, meaning the statement that was being projected to the world. But I believe it was Deke Slayton who asked him not to do it on the public part, wait until the microphone was off. They were particularly worried because just 6 months earlier, there was a big controversy in the United States amongst atheists here in the United States, because as probably many people remember, the crew of the Apollo 8, as they're orbiting the moon, read from the book of Genesis. And so that created a stir in the United States about the separation of church and state, and that the astronauts shouldn't be promoting religion while they're going around the moon. And so Deke Slayton was worried that, if Buzz did a communion ceremony also drank alcohol, this would be much worse. So Buzz was able to do it, but he waited until the microphone was off. Then you can read it in one of his books. There are a number of articles about this as well. He describes pouring the wine into the goblet. It slowly, goes down to the 1/6 gravity, and he says the prayer. And to this day, that goblet is still owned by the Webster Presbyterian Church. They do an annual ceremony or annual mass or ceremony honoring the moon landing. And I believe, there's something else, there's another part of this, but regardless, that's the main part of it. But that still exists at the Webster Presbyterian Church in Texas.
Right. Well, thank you. Yes, that was quite a revelation to some of us. Right. Well, what I've got is a question actually from Alex Wood again, who said, why is cognac the drink of choice?
I've heard two answers for this, and I think it's probably a combination of both. One is that, people always, when people ask me, when I tell them about alcohol in space, they'll often say, I bet there's a lot of vodka in space, assuming the Russians have brought it up. And when I tell them it's actually cognac most of the time, they're surprised. But from what I've heard, from, Russian sources, that cognac's an everyday drink. You drink every day. It's not very special. When you're in space, you want to drink something that's more special. Cognac's, a drink for special occasions. And so that's one of the reasons that it's, when you're in space, whenever you're drinking in space, it's for special occasions. And to be perfectly honest, most of the occasions I've heard of them drinking in space it hasn't been a daily activity. It's when there are special bonding times, when the crew, after a particularly stressful day, there's a new crew coming up, they use it as a bonding experience. But the other reason, though, is might go back to taste. As I mentioned before, people's taste buds are restricted or minimized, or for lack of a better word, hindered, when they're in space. And maybe just this taste of cognac is more suitable for that environment than vodka. So I've heard both of those reasons, and I suspect it's a combination of both. But at this point in time, I think even more so is tradition. And I think, and I didn't mention this in my talk, and I have a section in the book on this, tradition in space is a really big driver, particularly with the Russian Space Agency. They adhere to these traditions, many of which were created or not created. They were they are honoring the steps that Yuri Gagarin went through. And so I don't know, Yuri Gagarin brought cognac up. I don't know that at all. But I suspect if it became a tradition, somebody brought cognac up, based on what I know they do with other traditions, I can see how it might just turn into another one of those Russian traditions. Many of you might be aware of, because the cosmonauts currently follow the path that Yuri Gagarin followed before his launch. They literally follow it. They from the hotel, signing a door, and Yuri Gagarin on the way to the launch pad had to actually urinate. Sorry to talk about this, and so he had to get out of the bus on the way to the launch pad, and he relieved himself on the back tire of the bus. So to this point, before every launch, all the crew get out and either relieve themselves or they pretend they are on the back tire of the bus. And this is actually, ironically, has been a place where people will actually stow away their alcohol, because if they're checked for it before, they're supposed to keep their space suits shut. But since they're now opening up their space suits, this is where people often will slide bottles of cognac into their legs when they're unzipping their space suits to pretend or really urinate on the back tire of the bus, bringing them to the launch pad. So I probably went way off topic there, but it's just kind of a stream of consciousness, no pun intended there.
Right, well, thank you. We're coming to the end. I've got the last question here, which is much more of a statement than a question. If anyone, this is from Les Shoulder again, if anyone requires a list of exotic biomass that might be suitable for use, there are many little old ladies in the UK that are well versed in the arcane art of homemade wine. So we can offer you a complete list if you need it.
Oh, I'd like that list. I think it's fascinating. And
right, Les, there you are. You've got to get us the list.
Yeah, it would be interesting to cross-check that against crops that they think might grow well in these environments. And we do know there are crops that are better suited, at least we think. Potatoes being one of them, so the Martian, the book and the movie were actually pretty authentic. Others are like asparagus. I don't know that I've won an asparagus spirit, but but you never know.
Nettles grow extremely well in my garden. I think that's what I'll stick to. Right, well, I think we've come to the end of the questions here, which is fairly good timing. I'd like to say thank you. I'd say a quick cheers with my my beer here, because I think you deserve it for all the work you've done. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to see you in the UK at some point. One question I've got to ask, though, is what happens to a spirit level? I don't know whether you can actually see that I've got cufflinks that are a spirit level. When the bubble gets to the middle, then you know you're still sober.
So, I don't know.
Yeah, what happens in space? I will never know where the bubble goes.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see. You know, that's maybe you can propose that as an experiment.
Well, yeah,
I don't know the answer to that, but I think that would be a great new experiment to go to ISS. But once again, thank you for having me on. I wish I could have been there in person. That was the original intent, to be in London. You know, London's one of my favorite places on Earth, and so I do miss being there.
Well, when we're back in the office, we'll get you over, and we'll actually have a good old drink in the local pub.
Absolutely. I look forward to that. But until then, cheers, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. And I hopefully will be able to get back to some semblance of normal in the near future. But everybody stay safe and stay healthy.
Well, thank you very much. And before we break up, I'd like to make a couple of announcements, because we've actually got the next talk lined up. And that's going to be on the 22nd of July, when we've got Stephen Wisdom coming to talk. Well, not coming, but he'll be speaking to us about the BIS moon suit, designed by Harry Ross and Ralph Smith in 1952, I think it was. He'll be actually talking about the redesign he did and the rebuilding of a similar suit for the UK Space UK Space Centre up in Leicester, and he will be telling us how he came to build that and how accurate it is to the original design by Ross and Smith. So look forward to that. That'll be on the 22nd of July. So we'll say good night now, and thank you very much for coming on board, Chris, and thank you very much to Alan for making it happen, and to the audience for actually participating. Thanks a lot, and good night to all. Thank you.